The national parks of the United States are not only about the beauty of wild nature and the grandeur of mountains, they are also places where people disappear as if they have been erased from reality itself. Tommy Nash walked just 500 feet away to get water and returned 2 months later, convinced that no more than 15 minutes had passed. Janet Woods vanished before her friend's eyes in the geothermal hell of Lassen, leaving behind only a burnt belt and barefoot tracks leading nowhere. And Jack Billings went out to meet the dawn in the mountains of Wyoming and stepped straight into the void. His tracks ended on a dry plateau. 3 weeks later, only a compass was found in the center of a dead circle. These stories have one thing in common. The more clues rescuers found, the less logic there was. For any parent, this is the ultimate fear. The moment when you look away, and when you look back, your child is gone. Usually this fear lasts for a few panicked seconds until you find them behind a nearby tree. But for the Nash family, those few seconds stretched into 2 endless months. In August 2011, 15-year-old Thomas Nash, whom everyone called Tommy, left his family's tent in Sequoia National Park to fetch water from a stream. The stream was only 500 feet away. He disappeared in less than 10 minutes. The search yielded only strange, impossible clues. His jacket stretched over a thin branch more than 10 feet high, and traces of foreign clay on it. Then, 62 days later, when all hope was lost, Tommy Nash emerged from the forest. He was in perfect condition, and horrified that his camp had disappeared. According to his own estimate, he had been gone no more than 15 minutes. The Nash family from Phoenix, Arizona had come to California for their summer vacation. They were not avid hikers, but rather an ordinary family who had decided to swap the desert landscapes for the coolness and grandeur of the giant forests of Sequoia National Park. In mid-August, they set up camp at one of the official campsites. The place was idyllic, giant sequoias resembling the columns of an ancient temple, the smell of pine needles, and the soothing murmur of a nearby stream. August 22nd was their second day in the park. Towards evening, when the sun began to set behind the treetops, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the family was busy setting up camp. Tommy's mother prepared dinner while his father built a fire. They needed fresh water from the stream that flowed just 500 feet from their tent. The path to it was clearly visible. 15-year-old Tommy volunteered to go. He took a plastic jug and a small LED flashlight, as dusk was already falling in the shade of the giant trees. His father told him to be careful and come back quickly. That was the last time they saw him for the next 2 months. His parents continued with their activities. They heard the sound of the stream and saw the last rays of sunlight filtering through the treetops. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Tommy's father, feeling slightly uneasy, called his name. There was no answer. He called again, louder. Silence. Only the crackling of the fire and the sound of water. His feeling of unease instantly turned to fear. His father grabbed a flashlight and ran down the path to the stream. The scene he saw there was both reassuring and frightening. Their plastic canister, half full, was standing on the bank of the stream. This meant that Tommy had reached his destination, but the boy himself was nowhere to be found. His father shouted his name again and again. His cries were drowned out by the vast, indifferent forest. Returning to the camp, he and his wife made the right decision to immediately raise the alarm. Fortunately, there was a caretaker at the campsite who contacted the Central Ranger Station by radio. Within an hour, the first rescuers arrived on the scene. As darkness fell, the search operation began. Powerful beams of light pierced the darkness, and people's voices echoed between the giant tree trunks. The night brought no results. At dawn, the search resumed with renewed vigor. Dozens of volunteers and dog handlers with dogs joined the operation. The area was combed methodically, square by square. The first discovery was made closer to noon, about 160 feet from the stream. Off the trail, Tommy's flashlight lay in the fallen pine needles. It was turned off. No damage, no signs of a struggle around it. It was just lying on the ground, as if it had been dropped or placed there. The dogs, which had picked up Tommy's trail at the stream, began to act restless when they reached this spot and eventually lost the trail. But the strangest and most inexplicable find awaited the searchers ahead. One of the volunteers, combing through the thick undergrowth, accidentally looked up and saw a bright blue spot on a young pine tree. It was Tommy's windbreaker, but how it got there defied any logical explanation. The jacket was stretched over a thin, flexible branch at a height that was later measured at almost 10.5 feet. The branch was too thin to support the weight of a teenager trying to climb a tree. He couldn't have thrown it there with such precision. It wasn't just caught on the branch, it was neatly placed there, as if someone or something of enormous height had taken it off the boy and hung it there. There was no damage to the jacket, but reddish clay smears were found on the sleeves and back. The rangers who examined the site were puzzled. They called in a geologist who worked in the park. His conclusion was categorical. The soil in this area is granite decay and loam. There is no clay of this reddish hue here, and there never has been. The nearest deposits of such clay were hundreds of miles away in a completely different geological zone. Thus, at the end of the first day of the search, the rescuers had 3 facts. The boy had disappeared, leaving behind a half-full canister of water. His flashlight was lying on the ground 160 feet from the stream, and his jacket, stained with foreign clay, was hanging on a thin branch more than 10 feet above the ground. None of these clues pointed to a typical case of a lost hiker. They all pointed to something strange, illogical, and frightening. The search continued, but no one could guess what turn this story would take. The strange clues, the jacket in the tree and the foreign clay, threw the search operation off track. Standard protocols proved useless. The theory that the boy had simply gotten lost fell apart. The animal attack theory also didn't hold up. There were no traces of blood or signs of a struggle. That left kidnapping. But this theory was also full of inconsistencies. Why would a kidnapper take off the victim's jacket and hang it 10 feet up? And how could he have slipped into the busy camp unnoticed and carried the teenager away just as unnoticed? Despite the oddities, the search continued with increasing intensity. Tommy Nash's story made national news. Hundreds of volunteers from all over California converged on the park. Groups on foot and horseback patrols combed the area, while helicopters circled above the treetops. A photograph of the smiling, freckled teenager was posted on every pole and in every store for hundreds of miles around. His grief-stricken parents appeared before the press every day, begging for their son to be returned to them or for any information. But the forest remained silent. Week after week passed, and no new clues emerged. No other items of clothing or traces were found. A vast search party, equipped with the most modern technology, combed through one of America's most famous national parks and could not find a single clue as to the boy's fate. It was like fighting a ghost. By the end of September, a month after his disappearance, the large-scale operation began to wind down. Professional rescuers were needed elsewhere. Volunteers in despair went home. Hope was fading. By mid-October, the search was officially called off. In his final report, the Tulare County Sheriff wrote that, despite unprecedented efforts, the whereabouts of Thomas Nash could not be determined. He was declared presumed dead. For his family, it was the worst possible verdict. A verdict without a body, without answers, without closure. And then, just as the story was beginning to fade into memory, becoming just another tragic statistic, something incredible happened. On October 23rd, 62 days after Tommy's disappearance, a truck driver stopped at a gas station on the highway leading out of the park. He saw a teenager walking confusedly along the side of the road. The boy was dressed in a thin t-shirt and jeans, clearly not suitable for the cool October weather. He looked scared and confused. The driver recognized him. It was the face from thousands of posters. It was Tommy Nash. He stopped the car and cautiously called out to the boy. Tommy approached him and asked a question that shocked the man. "Sir, do you know where everyone has gone? I went to the stream to get water, and when I came back, there was no tent, no parents, no car. Nothing." His voice was trembling. He was sure that no more than 20 minutes had passed since he left the camp. The driver immediately called 911. The news that Tommy Nash had been found alive spread like wildfire. It was like a miracle. His parents, who had already returned to Arizona to mourn their son, jumped up and rushed to California. But the initial euphoria was followed by deep, disturbing confusion. When the first police officers arrived at the scene, They found Tommy in a state of extreme confusion. He repeated his story over and over again. He went to get water, filled his canister, and when he turned around, the camp was gone. He thought it was some kind of stupid prank. He shouted, calling for his parents, but no one answered. Then he got scared and followed a path that he thought would lead him to the road. He didn't walk far, maybe 10 minutes. One of the police officers, trying to clarify the situation, asked him a simple question. "Tommy, what day is it today?" Without hesitation, the boy replied, "August 22nd. At that moment, everyone present realized that they were dealing with something beyond their experience. They had to tell the teenager who had just lost his camp that it was already the end of October and that the whole country had been looking for him for 2 months. When Tommy heard this, he couldn't believe it. He looked at the police officers, the driver, the calendar in their car, and his face contorted with horror and complete incomprehension. For him, the world had just jumped 2 months into the future. His short walk for water had turned into a hole in time, and now he was on the other side of it. Tommy Nash was immediately taken to the hospital for a complete examination. The doctors, knowing that the boy had spent 2 months in the wild, expected to see exhaustion, dehydration, signs of frostbite, and dozens of other health problems. The results stunned them. The boy was in perfect condition. He hadn't lost a pound. Blood tests showed no signs of malnutrition or vitamin deficiency. His muscle tone was normal. There was nothing on his body except a few fresh scratches that could have been caused by walking through bushes. There were no insect bites, no severe cuts, no scars. From a medical point of view, there was no way he could have spent 62 days in the forests of Sierra Nevada. His physical condition matched his own account. He had been gone for only a few minutes. The best psychologists and psychiatrists worked with him. His story did not change one iota. He remembered in detail the morning of August 22nd, the road to the park, and setting up camp. His next conscious memory was standing by a stream, his camp gone. The 2-month gap simply did not exist for him. There was no black hole or vague images in his memory. There was only a smooth, seamless sequence of events from which a considerable chunk of time had fallen out. Time that the rest of the world had lived through. Official medicine and law enforcement had to provide some kind of explanation. The diagnosis was dissociative fugue with subsequent amnesia. According to this theory, some unknown traumatic factor caused Tommy to enter an altered state of consciousness. In this state, he allegedly lived for 2 months, somehow surviving. Then, when his consciousness returned to normal, his brain completely erased the memory of this traumatic period. But this theory, convenient for reports, did not explain anything. It did not explain his perfect physical condition. Even in a fugue state, a person must eat, drink, and protect themselves from the cold. It did not explain how a 15-year-old city teenager without equipment or skills could do this for 2 months. Most importantly, it did not explain the evidence, the jacket at a height of 10 feet and the clay from another region. There was another version, kidnapping. Supposedly, someone kidnapped Tommy, kept him somewhere for 2 months, fed him well and took care of him, and then, for some inexplicable reason, returned him. But this version also fell apart. No one demanded a ransom. The Nash family had no enemies. And again, why would a kidnapper hang a jacket on a tree? This scenario was even more absurd than the official diagnosis. The only version left was the one that no one dared to say out loud, but which everyone was thinking about. What if Tommy's story was the truth? What if he really was only gone for 15 minutes? What if he somehow stepped into a place where time flows differently? A place where the strange clay was left on his jacket, a place whose inhabitants, after returning him, left his coat behind as a peculiar sign, incomprehensible to us. The Thomas Nash case was closed. He returned home to his family. But his life was never the same again. He returned to a world that had moved on. He had to reacquaint himself with his friends and catch up on 2 months of schoolwork. To everyone else, he was a miracle, the boy who survived. But to himself, he was a man who had had 2 months of his life stolen, replaced by 15 minutes of horror and bewilderment. He never remembered what had happened to him. This story has no solution. There are only facts, time, place, and the state of a person. And these facts indicate that sometimes the boundaries of our reality become thinner than we think. and in the forests among the giant trees that stood here long before us, you can not only get lost in space, but also get lost in time. Lassen Volcanic National Park in California is a place where the Earth breathes. Here, hissing fumaroles release steam from the bowels of the planet, mud pots bubble with boiling sulfur, and the ground beneath your feet may be nothing more than a thin crust over a red-hot void. It is a landscape that is both mesmerizing and dangerously dangerous. Most tourists understand this threat and strictly follow the marked trails. Janet Woods understood it better than anyone else. At 34, she was an experienced guide and knew the mountains like the back of her hand. But on a clear September day, on a trail near the Bumpass Hell geothermal area, she disappeared. Her friend had turned away for just 10 minutes. When she looked back, Janet was gone. The search yielded nothing but two eerie, inexplicable finds: a burnt backpack strap 1.5 miles from where there was no sign of fire, and a trail of barefoot footprints on sharp volcanic rock leading to nowhere. It was an easy hike for them. Both women were in excellent physical shape, and Janet in particular had extensive hiking experience. She had led groups through the Sierra Nevada, knew the canyons of Utah, and had been to the wildest corners of California more than once. She was the kind of person who always brought the right equipment, checked the weather forecast, and never took unnecessary risks. Their destination was the Bumpass Hell Trail, one of the most famous in the park. The route consists of wooden walkways laid over boiling and steaming ground. Warning signs are posted everywhere, urging visitors to stay on the trail. Janet and Sarah walked most of the way, stopping at a lookout point overlooking the main pool. The landscape was surreal: yellow sulfur deposits, columns of steam, and a low rumbling coming from underground. It was around 2 in the afternoon. They decided to take a short break. They took off their backpacks. Sarah, who was into photography, decided that a spot a little higher up the slope, about 100 feet away, would offer the best view for a panoramic shot. She told Janet about it. Janet replied that she would wait by the backpacks and drink some water. They were on a safe, well-trodden section of the trail, far from dangerous geothermal areas. What happened next is known only from Sarah's account. She climbed onto a small ledge, took out her camera, and began adjusting the lens. She remembers fiddling with the settings for a few minutes, trying to get the lighting right. Then she took a few pictures. The whole process took, by her estimate, no more than 10 to 15 minutes. They were within sight of each other the entire time, even though Sarah was focused on the camera. When she finished and turned to call Janet, the spot where her friend had been sitting was empty. Her bright blue backpack was gone too. Sarah's first thought was perfectly mundane. Janet must have gone ahead on the trail or decided to return to the start of the route to wait for her. Sarah called her name. There was no answer. She shouted louder. The only response was the hissing of fumaroles and the whistling of the wind. Sarah went back to where they had stopped. Nothing. No note. No sign. She waited another 10 minutes, sure that she would soon see Janet coming toward her. But no one appeared. Her slight confusion began to turn into anxiety. She walked a little further along the trail, then returned to the start of the route. She asked other hikers if they had seen a woman in a green jacket with a blue backpack. No one had seen anything. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah was in a state of absolute panic. She made her way to the ranger station and reported her friend missing. The initial reaction was cautious. An adult, experienced hiker. Most likely a misunderstanding. They had simply passed each other. The rangers checked the parking lot. Janet's silver Subaru was still there. This was a bad sign. As dusk fell, a full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. Teams of rangers and volunteers began combing the Bumpass Hell Trail and adjacent routes. The night yielded no results. The search from the air was hampered by the rugged terrain, and the use of thermal imaging cameras proved useless. The entire area was glowing due to geothermal activity. One day passed, then another. The search expanded to cover larger areas. The result was zero. Investigators were at a loss. How could an experienced guide disappear from a busy trail on a clear day within 10 minutes, leaving absolutely no trace? There were no signs of a struggle. No one heard any cries for help. Search dogs brought to the spot where Janet was last seen picked up her scent, but it was lost after a few dozen feet on the rocky trail trampled by hundreds of other hikers. The theory that she had fallen into one of the mud pots was one of the first to be considered. But this seemed unlikely. She was sitting in a safe place, and to reach the nearest danger zone, she would have had to deliberately leave the trail and walk a considerable distance. In addition, such an incident would most likely have left some traces. A dropped item, skid marks, perhaps a scream that others would have heard. But there was nothing. Janet Woods and her backpack had simply vanished. The search team leader wrote in his report at the end of the second day, "The situation defies logical explanation. The lack of any clues is unprecedented." They did not yet know that the first and strangest clue would be found the next day. On the third day of the search, when hope of finding Janet alive had all but faded, one of the search teams combing a remote area a mile and a half north of the Bumpus Hell Trail made a strange discovery. It was a difficult-to-reach area, overgrown with sparse forest and covered with solidified lava rock. One of the volunteers noticed a small dark object on the ground. Coming closer, he realized it was a piece of nylon strap with a plastic buckle. Sarah Green, who was later shown the find, immediately recognized it. It was the waist strap from Janet's backpack, but the condition of the belt shocked everyone. It was badly burned and partially melted. The edges were charred, and the plastic buckle was deformed from the high temperature. The most inexplicable thing was that the belt was lying on dry pine needles, dozens of feet from the nearest rock outcrops. There were absolutely no signs of fire around it. No ashes, no burnt grass, no scorched branches on the trees. There were no traces of a recent lightning strike either. An unanswerable question arose. How could this belt have burned here without leaving any traces of fire around it? It was as if it had been burned somewhere else and then brought and thrown here. Or it had been exposed to some kind of local, extremely high heat source right at this spot. Neither version made sense. This discovery prompted the searchers to focus their efforts on this area. The teams began combing the area with redoubled attention, and a few hours later, about 1,000 feet from where the belt was found, a second, even more disturbing discovery was made. On an open section of the slope covered with acceptable sharp volcanic debris, the searchers discovered a chain of footprints. They were barefoot human footprints. The size matched Janet's foot size. The footprints were clear, indicating that the person who left them was either very heavy or moved slowly, pressing their feet deeply into the ground. But the very existence of these footprints was absurd. Why would an experienced hiker with sturdy hiking boots walk barefoot on the sharpest rocks? Walking barefoot here would not only be painful, but agonizing. Each foot would be cut to the bone, but there were no traces of blood near the footprints. And as in other similar cases, this story had its point of no return. After about 160 feet up the slope, the chain of barefoot tracks simply ended. It ended on a flat, open area of ground. There were no signs that Janet had fallen, sat down, or tried to grab onto anything. The last print of her left foot, and then completely untouched ground. It was as if she had taken one previous step and flown away. These two pieces of evidence, the burnt belt and the barefoot footprints leading nowhere, left investigators at a complete dead end. They did not bring them any closer to solving the mystery. On the contrary, they led them into the realm of complete irrationality. On the fourth day, the active search was called off. The park had been combed, and all possible scenarios had been explored. Janet Woods was officially declared missing under unexplained circumstances. The case was never solved. It joined the list of strange and unexplained disappearances in U.S. national parks. What happened to Janet Woods in those 10 minutes? Why did she take off her shoes and walk on sharp rocks? And what kind of heat source turned her backpack strap into a burnt piece of plastic without affecting anything around it? There are still no answers to these questions. There are only facts. The woman disappeared, and the clues she left behind defy the laws of logic and physics. The story of Janet Woods serves as a grim reminder that even in the most studied and popular places, there are mysteries that the human mind cannot comprehend. Some rituals connect a person with nature. For 52-year-old Jack Billings, one such ritual was watching the sunrise. An experienced hiker, he believed that the first rays of the sun touching the mountain peaks were a sight worth living for. In July 1991, while hiking in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, he left his tent in the pre-dawn mist, as usual, to take his short walk. His brother saw him leave. 40 minutes later, he had not returned. His footprints, clearly imprinted on the trail, led up the slope and simply ended on a flat, dry patch of ground, as if the man had been lifted out of the sky. 23 days later, 11 miles away, the only and last discovery was made: his pocket compass, lying in the center of a perfect circle of dead grass. Jack Billings was never found. He went out to meet the dawn and seemed to have stepped right into it. The Wind River Range in Wyoming is no place for beginners. It is a harsh, wild land of granite peaks, glacial cirques, and thousands of nameless lakes. Here the weather can change in a matter of minutes, and the nearest civilization is days away on foot. For brothers Jack and Mark Billings, it was a home away from home. They had walked these trails back and forth for 20 years. Jack, who was 52, was the brains of their tandem. Methodical, cautious, he planned every route down to the smallest detail. Mark, 10 years younger, had the strength and endurance. At the end of July 1991, they set up camp in a valley at the foot of an unnamed peak. It was the 5th day of their 2-week hike. On the morning of the 6th day, as always, Jack woke up before everyone else. The clock read 5:30 a.m. The sky in the east was just beginning to lighten. Mark, who had also woken up from the cold, watched his brother zip up his light windbreaker and check the laces on his boots. "I'm going to the ridge to watch the sunrise," Jack said quietly. It was his tradition. He took only a small notebook, a pen, and a pocket compass with him. He liked to make short notes about his morning walks. Mark nodded and wrapped himself back in his sleeping bag. He heard his brother's footsteps receding. The camp was once again plunged into silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind. About 40 minutes passed. The sun had already risen from behind the distant peaks, flooding the valley with golden light. Jack should have been back by now. Mark climbed out of the tent to light the coffee burner. He looked at the ridge, expecting to see his brother's figure descending, but it was empty. An hour passed. Mark began to worry. Jack was as punctual as clockwork. It wasn't like him to be late. Mark picked up his portable radio and called his brother. "Jack, this is Mark. Come in." All he heard in response was static. He tried several more times. The result was the same. Now his concern turned to real alarm. Maybe he had twisted his ankle? Fallen? Mark decided to follow his tracks. They were perfectly clear in the thin morning air on the dusty trail. Jack's boot prints led from the tent up the slope, along a well-trodden animal trail. Mark walked quickly, looking around carefully. He walked about half a mile, almost reaching the ridge. Here the trail led to a small flat plateau, a level, dry area covered with fine dust and stones. And here something happened that Mark Billings would never forget for the rest of his life. His brother's tracks reached the middle of this area and stopped. They weren't smudged or turned to the side. The last clear print of the right boot, and then absolutely flat, untouched dust. Mark walked around the spot several times. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, no scree or cracks in the ground where he could have fallen. No signs that his brother had tried to stop, turn around, or run. The tracks just ended. It was as if Jack had taken a step and vanished. In horror, Mark rushed back to camp. He tried again and again to call someone on the radio, but in this wilderness it was useless. In 1991, ordinary tourists did not have satellite phones. He realized that he would have to find his own way to civilization. Gathering the bare minimum, he left the camp untouched. He began the agonizing 2-day descent to the nearest ranger station. When he finally told his story, exhausted and frightened, they looked at him with disbelief. But a person's disappearance in Wind River is a serious matter. A search and rescue operation was immediately organized. A day later, the ranger team, along with Mark, reached the abandoned camp. Then they followed Jack's tracks to the plateau. An experienced tracker from the team confirmed Mark's words. The scene was inexplicable. The next day, dog handlers with the best search dogs were brought to the camp. The dog confidently picked up Jack's trail from the tent. She led the group precisely along the chain of his tracks, eagerly sniffing the ground. But when she reached the middle of the dry plateau, she stopped abruptly. She whimpered, tucked her tail between her legs, and began to circle in place. The trail had disappeared. The scent of the man who had been there simply broke off at one specific point. For everyone present, it was chilling confirmation. Something had happened that was beyond the scope of their many years of experience. The search operation in the Wind River Range lasted more than 3 weeks. It was one of the most extensive searches in the history of Wyoming. Dozens of rescuers, volunteers, and several helicopters combed square after square of hundreds of square miles of territory. The epicenter of the search was the very plateau where the tracks ended. Rescuers searched every rock, every crack in the rocks, but they found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a dropped notebook, not a trace of blood. Jack Billings had vanished without a trace. Gradually, the search was called off. Jack was officially declared missing, presumed dead as a result of an accident. But in private conversations, rescuers admitted that they had never encountered a case like this before. The story of the tracks leading nowhere became their internal folklore, a dark legend told to new recruits. Then, on the 23rd day after Jack's disappearance, when the main rescue team had already left the area, another strange event occurred. 2 geologists conducting research in a completely different remote part of the ridge, about 11 miles in a straight line from the site of the disappearance, stumbled upon an anomaly. They were on top of an old, weathered rock with no trails leading to it. The place was wild and rarely visited. On the flat top of this rock, they saw an almost perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. Inside this circle, all the sparse vegetation, grass and lichens, was dead, dry, and brown, while everything around it was green. It did not look like the remains of a campfire. The ground was not scorched. It looked more like it had been dried out, stripped of life. But the most striking thing was in the center of this circle. There, on the bare rock, lay a small metal object, glistening in the sun. Coming closer, the geologists realized that it was an old brass pocket compass. It was undamaged and lay as if someone had carefully placed it there. There were no tracks around it. The geologists reported their find by radio. When the compass was brought back to base, it was shown to Mark Billings. He recognized it immediately. It was his brother's compass, the one Jack always carried in his pocket. This discovery did not provide any answers. It raised even more questions. How did Jack's compass end up 11 miles from where he disappeared, in an area that was virtually impossible to reach? How did it end up in the center of a perfectly flat circle of dead grass? What was this circle? Was it a side effect of what happened to Jack, or was it some kind of message? None of these questions was ever answered. No other belongings or traces of Jack Billings were found. His body was never found. The official case was closed, but the mystery remained. And that's it. 3 stories, 3 tragedies, and not a single answer. A jacket in a tree, foreign clay, a burnt belt, barefoot tracks, disappearing tracks on the plateau, a compass in a circle of dead grass. Each detail seemed to deliberately pull the rug out from under the searchers' feet, leaving only cold horror and the realization that there are forces at work in these places that humans cannot comprehend. If you found this interesting, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you found most inexplicable. There are even more mysteries and disappearances ahead. You don't miss them.